Jim Farley is the CEO of Ford Motor Company. He's been in the auto industry for decades. He's seen it all, or so he thought. In late 2025, Farley did something that every major automaker does. He ordered his engineers to take apart competitors' vehicles, piece by piece, wire by wire, circuit by circuit. It's standard practice. You want to know what your competition is doing, right? But when they tore open a Chinese electric vehicle, Farley's team found something that stopped them cold. When we took apart the Chinese vehicles, Farley said, it was shocking what we found. Not impressive, not interesting, shocking. And what he discovered has led him to make a chilling warning. Chinese automakers pose an existential threat to American car companies. Those are his words, not mine. Let me show you what terrified one of the most powerful CEOs in America: the wiring nightmare. Here's what Ford found when they dismantled a Tesla Model 3 and compared it to their own Mustang Mach-E. The Ford had 1.6 kilometers of wiring. That's nearly 1 mile of electrical cables running through a single vehicle. The Tesla, significantly less. Now you might think, so what? Ford uses more wiring. Maybe they're being thorough. No. More wiring is bad. More wiring means more weight, more complexity, more points of failure, more cost, more time to assemble. It's everything you don't want in a modern electric vehicle. Tesla had already figured out how to simplify their electrical architecture. They'd streamlined it, made it elegant, made it efficient. But here's where it gets worse. When Ford opened up the Chinese EVs, the difference was even more dramatic. Chinese manufacturers had leapfrogged both Ford and Tesla in electrical design efficiency. Farley admitted he was very humbled by what they found. That's corporate speak for, we're in trouble. Think about what this means. Ford has been building cars for over 120 years. They pioneered the assembly line. They're supposed to be experts at manufacturing efficiency. And yet Chinese companies, some less than a decade old, are building electric vehicles with fundamentally superior architecture. The existential threat. So Farley used a phrase that should terrify anyone who works in the American auto industry. Existential threat. He said Chinese car companies have the capacity to take over the North American market and put homegrown automakers out of business. Let me break down what that means with actual data. Right now, China dominates global EV production. In 2024, Chinese automakers sold over 9 million electric vehicles domestically, more than the rest of the world combined. Companies like BYD, which most Americans have never heard of, are outproducing Tesla globally. BYD sold 3.2 million EVs in 2024, Tesla sold 1.8 million. But here's the hidden controversy that nobody's talking about. How did Chinese automakers get so far ahead? The answer involves 3 factors, and American auto executives don't like discussing any of them. First, vertical integration. Chinese EV makers control their entire supply chain. BYD doesn't just build cars, they manufacture their own batteries, their own semiconductors, even their own seat components. When there was a global chip shortage in 2021 to 2023, BYD barely flinched. They made their own chips. Ford? They're still dependent on dozens of outside suppliers. When one supplier has a problem, Ford's entire production line stops. Which brings us to the Nexperia crisis happening right now. A Dutch chipmaker called Nexperia, owned by a Chinese company Wingtech, was seized by the Dutch government in October 2025 over national security concerns. China retaliated by blocking Nexperia chips from leaving China. Those chips? They control basic car functions: windshield wipers, window controls, power steering. Honda has already reduced production. The European Automobile Manufacturers Association warned that assembly line stoppages might only be days away. Think about the absurdity. American and European automakers can't even make windshield wipers work without chips that flow through China. Meanwhile, Chinese automakers? Completely insulated. They control their own supply chain. The cost advantage. Second factor, cost. Here's data that should alarm you. Chinese EV manufacturers can produce electric vehicles for 30 to 40% less than American or European competitors, even with equivalent technology. How? Partly it's labor costs, but that's not the main factor anymore. China has heavily automated their production lines, sometimes more than American factories. The real answer? is scale and government support. The Chinese government has poured hundreds of billions of dollars in EV infrastructure, battery production, and manufacturing subsidies over the past decade. Meanwhile, the US passed the Inflation Reduction Act in 2022, which offered tax credits for EV buyers. It was a consumer subsidy, not a manufacturing one. Here's the controversy nobody wants to say out loud. China played the long game, and it worked. While American automakers spent the 2010s maximizing shareholder value and building bigger SUVs and trucks, because that's where the profit margins were, Chinese companies were investing in the technology that would define the 2020s and beyond. And now, the gap might be too wide to close. Ford's response has been to announce $5 billion in new EV investments. $5 billion sounds like a lot, until you realize that Chinese EV companies are collectively investing tens of billions per year, backed by state support. The electrical architecture. Remember that wiring problem? It's not just about using less copper. Chinese automakers have pioneered what's called domain controller and zonal architecture systems. Here's what that means in plain English. Traditional cars, including most American EVs, use dozens of separate computers scattered throughout the vehicle. One computer controls the windows, another controls the air conditioning, another handles the entertainment system. Each computer needs its own wiring harness connecting it to sensors and controls. It's inefficient, it's heavy, it's expensive. Newer Chinese EVs use a centralized computing architecture. A few powerful computers control everything. The wiring is dramatically simplified. By 2025, 1/3 of Chinese manufactured cars feature these advanced architectures. The global average? Much lower. Tesla has been moving in this direction, but Chinese companies are already there and they're iterating faster. Here's the hidden implication. Chinese EVs aren't just cheaper, they're better engineered. That's what terrified Jim Farley. It wasn't just that Chinese automakers were competitive, it's that they'd fundamentally rethought how to build a car, and they'd done it better than companies with a century of experience. The brutal truth. So what did Ford do after this shocking discovery? Farley said it led to a brutal business decision. Ford has now split its operations into 3 divisions: Ford Blue, traditional gas vehicles; Ford Model E, EVs; and Ford Pro, commercial vehicles. The EV division is essentially starting from scratch with new design principles. But here's what should worry you. Even with this restructuring, Ford expects EVs to represent only 5% of the US car market in the near term. That's Ford's own projection, 5%. Why so low? Because they know what's coming. Chinese EVs aren't in the US market yet, at least not in meaningful numbers. But they're coming. And when they arrive with prices 30 to 40% less than American EVs, with better technology and with proven reliability, what do you think American consumers will choose? The US government knows this. That's why the Trump administration has maintained steep tariffs on Chinese vehicles. But tariffs are a band-aid, not a solution. They protect American companies temporarily. They don't make them competitive. Here's the question nobody wants to answer. What happens when Chinese automakers start building factories in Mexico or Canada inside the USMCA trade zone to bypass US tariffs? Because that's exactly what Japanese and Korean automakers did in the 1980s and 1990s when they faced similar barriers. They built American factories, hired American workers, and they still captured market share from Ford, GM, and Chrysler. Chinese companies are already exploring this strategy. Jim Farley's existential threat warning isn't hyperbole, it's a preview. American automakers spent decades optimizing for the wrong metrics: bigger vehicles, higher margins, shareholder returns. They assumed their dominance was permanent. Chinese companies backed by state support and long-term strategic planning built for the future. And when Farley's engineers opened those vehicles, they saw that future. And it didn't include Ford, at least not in its current form. The wiring was just the symptom. The disease? American automakers bet on the past while their competitors built the future. And now, that future is arriving faster than anyone expected.